Hello and welcome to another episode of AI in the Classroom Daily. This is a podcast helping educators make sense of AI without the hype. I'm Dan Cogan-Drew, co-founder and chief academic officer here at Newsella. And today I'm talking with Carl Johnson. Carl is the associate director at NEASC, the New England Association of Schools and Colleges, and he visits schools constantly around the region and internationally. Carl was a principal before moving into this role, and now he's running workshops with school leaders about how to actually use AI in their work as a tool that might take some of the administrative workload off their plate so that they can do more of the work that they got into this job originally to do. We talk about what's eating the time in a principal's day. Carl describes the day as, and I love this, a movie with no transitions, just one hard cut after another. We get into specific practical things that you can do starting tomorrow, and we talk about the bigger question that I think sits underneath a lot of the uneasiness that people are feeling right now, which is what are the skills that we should be helping students develop when the world is shifting underneath us? It's a great conversation. Stick around. You're going to love it. Carl, thanks so much for joining us on the show today. And we're going to dive into a lot of topics, but I thought we could just start, if you could just explain a little bit about what NEASC is and what is an accreditation body so that our audience gets a sense of where you sit in the education ecosystem.
Yeah, so the New England Association of Schools and Colleges, which I think everyone pretty much refers to as NEASC, we're the oldest regional accreditor in the United States. And traditionally, where that got that start was accrediting both higher education and then also K through 12 schools. I think a pretty big shift that occurred was moving from coherence to really growth models. And so what we really do is try to partner with schools to help them navigate their own growth and their school improvement. And the way we do that is through a framework of standards, and we have a protocol that we use where we rely on outside visitors from other schools who come in and visit the schools and help them think about their growth and their goals, and just really provide that outside accountability and that outside perspective to help schools ensure that they're working on the things they should be working on. So it's exciting work. It's a lot of fun. It's one of the best parts about my job is I get to visit lots of schools around New England, and I've also had the opportunity to visit some schools internationally. I'll just mention, I think one of the things a lot of people don't know about NEASC is that we work with both domestic schools. So in New England public schools, we also work with independent schools. And then we also work with international schools around the world. I believe currently we're represented in 92 countries. So we have a pretty far reach. And one of the things I always talk about with our member schools in New England is you're part of this network of schools that's all thinking about the same issues and the same problems and trying to come up with the best ideas and network with each other and connect with each other to try to get those ideas back.
Yeah. And so speaking of that, I think that puts you in a really interesting position to move across schools, districts, nationally, internationally, all across the region. What has surprised you? You've had your own experience as a building principal, and now you're in conversation with and visiting in many cases face-to-face with hundreds of schools. In all your travels, like what's surprising you these days?
So I would say one of the most surprising things to me was I was very fortunate this year. I got to go to Dubai. We co-hosted a conference in Dubai. And one of the most interesting things to me, I was able to present on AI at that conference. And it was really interesting to see that you can travel 14 hours on a plane and they're dealing with a lot of the same issues that we're dealing with here in the United States. And, struggling with the same questions and the same problems of how do we prepare kids for the future and what's the right path and how do we work through these issues that we're all challenged with. I think one of the hardest things when I was a building principal was you're in your kind of closed little environment. And so trying to break out of that and see how other people are approaching problems and things like that's incredibly beneficial, and just being able to see that problem solving.
It's interesting to me always, a lot of what you're saying resonates because of the isolation that educators sometimes feel in their own classroom of like the suspicion that there must be a better way to do this because teaching is so difficult and running schools is so difficult. You're always thinking there's got to be an easier way. I'm running into something. And whenever someone visits from the outside world who's traveled to other districts and other classrooms, you're always curious. And when I travel, people always ask me like, so how are other people doing this? Not necessarily to copy, but just to get a point of reference they want to understand. So that's a useful reminder that AI is a global thing that we're all going through.
Yeah. And I think you're really hitting upon something really important, which is I think one of the most powerful things we do when you asked about accreditation and what we do is giving that opportunity for people to go on visiting teams and go to other schools and learn about that and see that. But then also too is exactly like you said, the isolation. And I'm a big believer that being principal, I always thought that elementary school principals had it hardest because a lot of times they're the only administrator in the building, and it's just they have to figure things out on their own. And then I didn't really grasp how lonely the principalship would be when you're a principal of a high school too, because a lot of times ultimately it's coming down to your decision and you ultimately have to make the choice. So having that outside perspective of people who can, one, assure you're doing the right thing or validating that, but then also sometimes giving you guidance of, have you thought about this? Or have you thought about maybe trying this method instead? That can be really powerful.
But one of the things that you've written about is the challenges and difficulties of being a principal, and you offer free workshops to make the job of a principal, as you say, 10% easier. What are some of the things that are eating the time or the energy of a principal on a weekly basis?
Yeah, I always describe being a principal as like a movie with no transitions. So it's just one hard cut after another. And you can move from walking up to a classroom to celebrate a student who just got an award to then within 30 seconds, you're back in your office making a really challenging phone call to a family. But then 5 minutes later, you're meeting with a teacher to talk about something, maybe a difficult conversation, to then going back to talking with kids in the hallway and celebrating maybe a sports game on Friday or something. So I think that's one of the hardest adjustments people make. And when I approach those workshops and think about AI, I tell people the reason why I'm so passionate about this and so interested in this is, in my opinion, I think it's the first time in a while where I see something that could potentially take some things off of people's plates, a technology that could make this a little bit easier. And like you said, the line I always use when I do workshops is, if you can get something from today that makes your job 1% better, it makes it 5% better, it makes it 10% better, whatever that is. And what I mean by better, I should just be, every principal wants to be in classrooms, observing learning and interacting with kids and helping teachers get better at their work and doing that kind of work. So if we can somehow, through what we do during a workshop or helping principals learn more about this technology, just some way of helping them figure something out that's going to make it a little bit easier, and we can get them in classrooms doing those things, then, that's why people went into the role. That's why they want to be principals. That's why they want to support schools. So,
yeah. And I think that's a really important centering of what is it that they most want to be doing. And then you can prioritize around that, and you can see all the things that they have to do that aren't the thing that they most want to do. But we're going to get to some of your approaches to using AI as a way to help principals, and I won't frame it further than that. I'll let you tell us more. But before we get to the sort of upside of AI, I wonder if you could describe a little bit of how you see ways in which AI and its emergence in the last couple of years is adding pressure. Like, what is it doing if it's coming in orthogonally to the principal's workday, work week, the year? How is it adding to the challenges that they face? And then we'll get into some of the solutions that you've been experimenting with.
Yeah. So I think, in my opinion, one of the big things here is it's another significant decision to make about your community and your school, right? So you can look at it from multiple angles. So one is just, how are you going to, if you make the decision that you're going to access this and you're going to use this technology and you want your teachers using it. So one, where are you going to carve out the time? Where are you going to cover out the resources to upskill people? Well, development time and professional learning time is so strained as it is. I don't think the average person understands how little time there actually is for teachers to work on professional learning and things like that. So that's a huge challenge. And that's not even getting into then, which I think is the biggest question of them all, is how do we bring this to students? And that to me is the, I don't know, you want to call it the $1 trillion question, $1 million question, whatever you want to call it. That is an incredibly complex argument to navigate right now. And if you're at all interested in AI and watching what is happening, people are dividing into camps around what should be done or what shouldn't be done. And so principals have to figure out a way to navigate that and figure out a way that they're going to lead their schools and try to make clear decisions. And to me, this is a really challenging one because there isn't consensus around what the right answer is. I know districts who have completely banned it on their servers. They don't want any AI use by staff. They don't want any AI use by students. I know other schools and districts that have gone all in, where they're opening up the use of Gemini and things like that for students. and really trying to think about how they teach them about those tools and things like that. One of the things I struggle with is when you're in the middle of that situation, and it's nice to be able to philosophize and argue about what the right answer is, but ultimately you have to make a decision for your community.
Yeah, and I mean, I think you keep coming back and using the word decision, and I think that really centers my thinking about the position. It helps me put myself in the shoes of the building leader, because at the end of the day, a decision has to be made. You can feel the time pressure, you can feel the urgency, and you can almost hear the voices on all sides. It reminds me that there have been studies done of the number of decisions teachers make. And it's something like 1,400 decisions before lunch. It's absurd to think about. And they vary, just like you were talking about, the sort of jump cut of the visual of what a day in the life looks like. Is like they vary in severity, scale, impact, timeliness. Some of them are throwaway decisions. You could walk them back if you make the wrong one. And others are like, nope, that kid is now out the door and I cannot get them back in, and I should not have let them go to the bathroom. Relatively minor, and I'll learn, but it's the decisions, and that fatigue builds up. And I'm sure it must for principals as well, even more so.
Yeah, and I think exactly what you're hitting upon too is just for everyone, the bandwidth right now. I mean, I think people are stretched really thin in education, and adding on a giant question mark of AI and what that means for our industry and what that means for who we are. One of the classic things I hear from administrators whenever I do a workshop is they feel like they're behind, that they don't know enough about this technology. And so I think there's an urge among some people at that point to just stop, right? Because I'm so far behind that I can't possibly catch up. And so the message I constantly try to send is I think I'm someone who's deeply interested in this and spend too much time listening to podcasts and reading books and on my own time. And I tell them, I feel like I'm behind. And then you hear about people who are working in these companies, and they talk about how they feel like they're behind. So I try to convey, if you haven't started learning about this, now is the time to just jump in and learn what you can and look for resources that can convey that. I mean, like your podcast, like Substack articles, things like that, where you can consume that and start to learn more.
We're on the precipice of looking into the abyss here and thinking to ourselves, like, how enormous a challenge this is. And we're gonna pull back from that in a minute and give listeners some hope and concrete actions they can think about taking. But I just want to reflect for a second on what you were describing, that dynamic of we're behind. And I think educators hear that so often because education is often accused of moving so slowly, the implication too slowly. And at the same time, we know that like learning is difficult and you don't discover new ways of learning that revolutionize everything. It just doesn't happen overnight. And so these sort of sharp turns to the right and the idea that you could be nimble as a business, if everything could run like a business and we could all be more entrepreneurial, then kids would learn faster and they would learn better and we would optimize all kinds of things. And there are good reasons why we don't make sudden turns, because some consistency and structure is a good thing. I did an episode recently looking at some of the actual data on use of AI in industry, broadly speaking, in different sectors compared with education. And to your point, education as a sector is not falling further behind than any other sector. In fact, it leads some other sectors. And so I think to reassure the audience, breathe, it's okay. It is enormous and it is daunting, but the urgency of let's move faster is, I think, an imagined one, and is probably ginned up by a lot of the hype coming from the people who make the technology, who want you to feel like you're behind until you're using their product.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're exactly right. We're trying to cut through the hype of what's marketing and what's actual practice. If you're only catching the periphery of what's happening, it's very easy to fall into that of this is somehow this almost like mystical thing, and I couldn't possibly understand it. I couldn't possibly interact with it. The point I love to make when I do the workshops is, I think educators are incredibly well positioned to use generative AI and to use these tools. And where I take that from is a lot of the skills that I find are most useful when you're using these things are the exact same skills you use with students in the classroom. And we're very good at getting, I want to call it non-compliant, but like if you're interacting with an LLM and it's not giving you what you want, like we're really good at asking questions or reframing things or putting it in a different way to try to get the answer. I spent a lot of my career with teaching history to juniors in high school. Like, not every kid that was sitting in that room wanted to be a historian. So I feel like I have some experience at trying to put things in different language or reframe things. I think teachers are some of the best at trial and error and trying different methods. And we're incredibly reflective generally as a group. And so all of those skills that you've built over time working with students and working in your classroom, if you transfer those to this technology, it unlocks a lot of what I think people try to do courses on and things like that. So
I think that's a great observation. And it definitely reminds me of those teaching moments and trying to understand and rephrase. And I know what I'm trying to accomplish, but I'm not there yet. And the trial and error is like in the nature of teaching and learning.
I think one of the things that you constantly hear about whenever you listen to people talk about using these systems, it's defining tasks, right? If you can really clearly define a task for these systems, usually you can get a pretty strong output. And if you provide the context, and that's a lot of what we do as educators. We try to really clearly define a task for students and try to get them to understand what we want them to learn, what we want them to accomplish. When I talk to educators about this, my big point is you're already ahead of a lot of other industries in terms of using this technology. And so if you don't view it as this mystical thing and just view it as I have a lot of these skills already and I can use this here, then you're going to be okay.
Yeah, that's a great mindset. And I think it would ease some of the worries, especially now we're at the beginning of August and the back to school is looming and is about to start in many places around the country. So how have you seen principals use some tool that uses AI in some form to reap some benefits here and reclaim some time to do more of the things that they want to be doing?
Yeah, one of my favorite stories ever, a friend of mine, he was telling me how over the summer they had brainstorming sessions. And I think a lot of school leaders have a whiteboard in their office where they're brainstorming ideas for the year. And okay, where are we going to do this professional learning? How are we going to use this PD day? What are our strategic goals? How are we going to accomplish those? Like the action steps, all these things. And so he talked to me about how after these brainstorming sessions over multiple meetings, he had this absolute mess of a whiteboard that just has just tons of ideas on there and captured different pieces of these things they wanted to do during the year. And so a lot of school leaders, they wanted to be able to present this to their staff when they came back. So one version of that is you sit down in your office and now you try to put together a slide deck or whatever it may be that's going to capture these ideas and try to convey that. So what he did instead was he took a photo of the whiteboard. He had a feeling that this might work just from his use of AI in the past, generative AI. And so he threw it in, and sure enough, it was able to take all those notes and all those kind of ideas. And obviously, in prompting, it gave it some context and talked to it and gave it some understanding of the work they were talking about, and then was able to create a slide deck off of that. And his point was, and obviously, like one of the biggest things, and I know you talk about this too, the human authentication piece. It's not creating that slide deck and just hitting save, but it got him to a draft point where he could have muddled for hours trying to figure out how to put things together, where now he had a draft that he could iterate with and change and make better. He just talked to me about that was a task that probably would have taken hours and consumed huge amounts of time trying to get that right, to something that was significantly quicker. And not only that, but he felt like it was a stronger, clearer picture of what they were trying to deliver.
That's a great example of just going with, I think it might know how to do this. Let's find out. And then especially having the authority, because having been in the room, if it's hallucinating something, because you were there, right? Like, what am I going to believe? Like the AI or my lying eyes? Like, I know if it is inventing something that we did not talk about, so I can hold it accountable. And I think one of the things that's really liberating here is that because of the amount of work that it takes to do that transcription and decide how to package this and send it on, you might think to yourself, I would like to do a whiteboarding exercise, but the cost of it is going to be significant because cleaning that up and sending it out is there's 3 hours of hidden work waiting for me. And you might decide you don't want to do it. And this could actually free you of that and just say, yeah, we're going to do it because I know the follow-up is not going to be a bear.
Which recently on an episode you did, I heard you talk about the idea of critical distance. And I think that's what you're referring to, is the idea that he's done a lot of presentations like that. He's done a lot of this work around strategic thinking. And so when he gets that output, he has the critical distance to be able to step back and say, yeah, this part looks good. That's what I would do. This doesn't make any sense. One of the things I find that's really interesting with people who are first using generative AI, I heard this on a podcast once, is that our cultural beliefs about artificial intelligence. So if you go back to like Space Odyssey or something, where it's like this thing is omnipotent and it's never wrong, is butting up against the reality of what we have right now is really interesting to me. That people, like when I say like you need to tell it when it's wrong, you can tell it like that's not what I want, like that's a bad answer, but it's like this light bulb moment. It's a very different way to interact with it, which I think is that's an unlock for people sometimes. I think like my favorite example of this I always tell people is I can't tell you how many times, and I feel like this is like confession, but like I can't tell you how many times I did the poster exercises where you put up the whiteboard, people walk around, they write ideas, right? And when I left the principalship, I had a roll of poster papers in the corner of my office behind the file cabinet of all these exercises we had done over the years. And even if you do nothing else, right? Even if you use this in no other way, if you just walk around the room and take photos of those posters and then put that into a system to then, however you want to think about it, create some kind of a one-page summary, organize those ideas into categories or themes or whatever it is, that unlocks so much knowledge and so much work. I just think about all the sessions that stuff just floats away, right? Like you have these great conversations and then it just floats away. And it's like, this is an unlock to be able to capture that stuff and hold on to it.
Yeah, because you schedule an hour for the meeting, but you don't schedule the 3 hours that come after. You just figure at some point I'm going to squeeze that in, and you end up not being able to do it. And then the participants don't receive the sort of like, here's what we learned, here are the takeaways, here are the next steps that are anchored in the conversation that we had in a specific way. That's a great example. And there's also a tension. It's interesting that it just occurred to me in what you're describing. Like I've been thinking in this like critical distance concept that one of the challenges that younger learners, because they don't have enough lived experience, have when they're one-on-one with the AI is that they don't have anything to compare it to, right? They can't say, that's what the AI says, but I've also heard responses that sound like this, and my friend says this, and my teacher says that. And that sort of isolation can lead to a real sort of warping and distortion of reality and what like baseline expectations should be. But you're also describing the older folks, myself, maybe you, who have embedded like social cultural norms and expectations around AI and like the HAL 2000 computer and the omnipotence of AI. And so we have to confront a reality that runs counter to our sort of cultural inbreeding.
Yeah, and it goes back to what we said earlier, like that's that really challenging navigation because you have very different perceptions of what we're dealing with here. I mean, I listen to a lot of podcasts about AI, and the people who are at like the furthest forefront of working with these technologies, like they can't agree on what exactly is happening. I just listened to a great episode about AI consciousness, and there's a massive debate about that. Then you zoom down to some principals sitting in their office trying to navigate this conversation. That's really challenging. One of the things I think about a lot, I think you just hit upon it. It's the thing I have a hard time with, and I always say this when I do workshops, is I think people sometimes mischaracterize because I'm really interested in this technology and I try to spend a lot of time learning about it to convey that to adults and to convey that to principals. I don't know how to use this with students yet. And I have a lot of reservations about how students should use this. I have a 10-year-old and a 12-year-old. I would not let them loose with an LLM right now, right? And the big thing I just think about is they don't have the context, they don't have the background knowledge to authenticate what's happening. And I think even for adults, that's a really important point. I feel confident when I'm doing something with it around education and pieces like that, or my background as a history teacher, I would feel very confident. If I start trying to do chemistry work with this thing, like I'm in a lot of trouble, right? Because very quickly I'm going to get in front of my skis. That's going to get really problematic. And I think that's where people get in a real danger zone. And so the trouble I have is figuring out what we do with students, because so much of education is the struggle and the learning and the gaining that world knowledge to be able to then discern and make decisions about what's right and what's not. An episode you recently talked about how it doesn't really mirror real conversation. This isn't how humans really talk to each other. And so if a kid is just sitting at home talking with this thing, it's giving them a really false impression of what that back and forth in life is like.
And that kind of caution you have about your 10-year-old and 12-year-old is echoed by the recent gathering of students, this nationally representative student body that met in Boston to pass a policy recommendation on AI. They also strong reservations about younger than high school. I think they were all high schoolers, but they felt that not until high school should students, for example, get feedback on their writing. And this is the first generation, even 3 years, 4 years of exposure, and they are already sensitized to that. You've also brought up another example, and I want to prompt you to tell us a little bit about that one. You mentioned that principals really want to spend more time in classrooms. And coming out of each of those visits, those observations, formal or informal, they have work to do. And you gave an example of how AI can help with this. Could you just share that a little bit for our audience?
Yeah. So I will be the first one to admit, I like to think I was one of the best principals at getting into classrooms and watching learning and wanting to interact with students. And I will also say I was probably one of the worst principals at finishing the write-ups and doing the evaluation work, that checking the boxes that you had to do in the evaluation system. So one of the things I talk to school leaders about is, finding the time in your day or finding the wasted time where you can check some of these things off. And so I think one of the biggest tools that school leaders at this point aren't using, and I try to really convey to them, is voice mode inside Gemini, ChatGPT, Claude, whichever version you're using. Voice mode is a really powerful tool, and it allows you to work in a way that is very different. And I'll be honest, it feels very strange at first. I tend to use voice mode in my car because to me, that's when it feels the least weird, because I just think other people see me and they assume I'm talking on the phone. So I don't feel like I'm as crazy as if I was walking around. So I always talk to principals about the fact, if you went in and observed a classroom and you preload this, so you build in, give it your rubric for your evaluation system, give it your strategic goals for the year, do that kind of stuff. And then on your drive home from work, if you have a half-hour ride and you don't use that for something else. My version is I created it as a podcast host. So when I do stuff like this, it asks me questions just like we're doing right now and tries to have a conversation with me. And is it perfect? No, but it's also amazing what you can accomplish in 15 minutes just by having a conversation. So if you turn that observation into talking on the ride home about what you saw in the class and what happened, and then tomorrow you go in and now you go back to your desktop or your computer and you have a draft of that observation that you can now authenticate and you can edit, I think I would have been much more successful with that. My enemy was always the blank screen. And I know for some people that's not true. And one of my biggest messages is, you find the way that you want to use AI. You don't have to use it all the same way. So some people love the blank screen. I hated it, right? So if I have a draft that I can edit and start to work through, I'm going to be much more successful. Where other people I think might want to start with it, write their own draft and then use it to critique it or get feedback or things like that, which is okay too. The big message I just want to say that I didn't hit is, one is knowing the privacy issues, knowing those things, just making sure you're using a system that you're confident in. I always say, as educators, we're really good talking anonymously. So we can also talk in generalities about things and get a really good draft of something without getting into personal information, specifics, things like that. And then also too, I know you talk a lot about this, and this is a very deeply held belief of mine about this, is being really transparent about how you're using AI. And so if I was going to be doing that as a principal, I would be very transparent about how I'm doing this and explaining my workflow to my teachers so they feel comfortable with this as well. And if I had an educator who was really uncomfortable with this or really opposed, then we figure out something different. I just think the openness and transparency around this stuff is critical. And mainly just because so much of what's happening right now, I think, is shadow use. People using it, just the way you interact with these things, it negates itself to secrecy. And so just trying to open that up and talking about this so we can figure out when we should use it and when we shouldn't use it. Let's have those conversations instead of just each doing it secretly at our house.
So it's such a good model for how to think about this sort of openness and the collaborative aspect of sharing that with your teachers, and then being open to alternatives. I can imagine, just as you led with there, the privacy concerns, is to say, what are you going to be saying about me and where is this going to be going? And so, okay, so that's a concern that you have. What could we do to address that? Like, I could show you the settings on the technology, but maybe you don't trust that. Okay, then when I do my write-ups, I will never use the last name. I will refrain from personally identifiable information. So even if this were to leak in the worst sense, it won't come back to you. Is that acceptable? And then the benefit of it, I think, might be obvious, but what we're saying is that, like, I'm hoping that by using this, I'm going to be able to get you like the feedback that is timely and specific and therefore valuable and makes my classroom observation worth something to you and not just a bureaucratic exercise. I can do that in 24 hours or 48 hours and not 2 weeks or never. And I think in some cases, AI is showing up in places like it's a better alternative to nothing because there are practices that aren't happening. And you have to be careful because you could do a deal with the devil there, but there are ways to manage it. So I'll confess, it's been a couple decades since I was a classroom teacher, but I remember being observed. I remember none of my observation notes, right? Like I guess they happened.
I don't want to belabor this, but I just think what you said is so critical, which is if you're being transparent and you're being open about it, explaining why you're using this to the staff, right? Or using this to teachers. Like, what is your goal in using this? Just saying, like, I don't want to spend time on this. And this is just to me, I view this as a useless activity. And so I'm just going to run it in generative AI is very different from explaining that I want to get you feedback as quickly as possible so that we can improve teaching and we can do that work, right? And so if you don't say anything, you're allowing people to make their assumption about why you're using it, right? I think what you said is just really critical, and I don't mean to belabor it, but I just wanted to highlight that.
No, great. And people fill the vacuum with assumptions, and generally not the better assumption. Like they tend to assume the worst. When we were talking previously before the show, you were having a reflection. It was like, we've seen this before. And you were referring back to smartphones and social media. And I wonder, can you share a little bit of your perspective here, like the long view on where you think we are relative to what you've already seen in schools?
Yeah. So my teaching career began in 2004. And so when I was talking to you previously, I just mentioned how one of my biggest fears right now is that we're falling into the same mistakes and some of the traps that happened with smartphones and social media. And one of the things I talk about is I can remember having some faculty meetings right around 2008, really having kind of a contentious discussion about smartphones and how this was going to be. And I was all on the side of this is a new technology. Kids need to know how to use it. We should be embracing this. We should be figuring out ways to use this in the classroom. And then I joke, by the time I left the principalship, like if I could have rented a wood chipper and put it in the front of the school and put everyone's smartphones through it, I probably would have done it. So my point I always make during the workshops is I approach these workshops from a point of, if you are an administrator or a school leader who hates everything about AI and thinks it's the worst thing that's happened in education in your entire career, or you are the most excited you've been in your career about the potential of this technology, I want you to learn about it so that we can have informed conversations. And not only that, but be leaders in this space and try to sway the conversation around this. I think one of the biggest mistakes, and I own this, I think I should have been better about this, was really trying to be open about the concerns we were seeing and what was happening with kids. And I think there's been a massive shift around social media and smartphones in the past couple of years. But I think if you talk to any educator, like we've seen that now for years, right? And so there was an assumption, I think, that we could somehow keep that outside the school, that this wasn't going to somehow come in. And I worry that if we do the same thing with AI, like I said, the people who feel like they're behind and they just feel like I'm just going to ignore this, I'm just going to pretend like this isn't happening, we're defaulting to allowing these companies or other people to decide how kids are going to use this stuff. And we need to have a bigger voice in it than that. That to me is a real concern. And I want people to learn about, even if you come to my workshop and you walk away and you say, this is the worst technology I've ever seen and I don't think anyone should be using it, then good. But keep on learning about it and have your voice be heard.
So I'm thinking of this in terms of the decisions that you were pointing to. And I was thinking to myself, how plausible is the decision to not allow this in? What is the price to be paid or the consequence of that? And I think maybe what you're pointing to is reserve and respect the right of school leaders to make that call on behalf of their building and their learning environment. But what you're saying is that it's not really an option for them to decide to, like the can't see, can't hear, won't speak. Like, that's not an option. That really is not a decision that's on the table. They have to, especially perhaps if they feel that way, they have to be digging into these conversations.
Yeah, and I'm sure you see this too. I speak to a lot of people who they tried ChatGPT 2 years ago and then they stopped using it. And so their beliefs about what this is locked in a time capsule of what was capable 2 years ago. We've mentioned Ethan Mollick together, and he talks about those 3 sleepless nights. And the way I refer to it is the get up and walk away from your desk moments. And there's periods that go by where I don't have a get up and walk away from my desk moment. But recently I was using Claude Cowork and did something. And I always joke, like, I have to go take my dog for a walk because I need to just wrap my head around what just happened, because it's making me question, like, the way I'm going to work with things, what I'm going to do. And so what I worry about is if you're, like you said, if you're burying your head in the sand and pretending this is going away, I don't see any signs that is true. If I thought there was some sign that could possibly be the case, maybe I could buy into that argument. I don't see any signs out there that somehow this technology is going away or that it's not going to have a massive impact on what we do as educators.
And to pick up on that, what Malik also says, just remember that the AI you're using today is the worst that it will ever be, right? And it depends the dimensions you want to use to measure quality. But the point is generally it's constantly evolving, right?
Yeah.
You need to update your understanding on a pretty regular basis. So as we start to think about closing out here, you're leading workshops all over the world and having conversations with building leaders. I just want to play act a scenario here where I've just attended one of your workshops. You've impressed me with the need for me to be paying attention, which I was suspicious of, but now I'm kind of bought in on. But now I'm completely overwhelmed with, like, you just said you were using Claude Cowork. Like, I have a cousin who's an engineer who uses Claude Cowork. Like, what in the what? So I'm daunted, but I feel a responsibility to do something. Can you give me some advice as to where to look for a first step? Like, how should I think about approaching this? What would be like day one for me?
Yeah, so it's funny the way you asked. A lot of times when I do these workshops, I'll have a principal ask, okay, like, what's the first thing I should do with my leadership team? Like, what's the first way I could use this? So my first advice, just because I think it's one of the most useful, right, is I tell them, if you can get an agreement about this, so obviously be open about this, don't do this in secrecy. Almost every administrative team has a weekly meeting or a twice a week meeting where they discuss what's happening, plans, action steps, all this kind of thing. So if you can get in the habit of recording that meeting and then putting that transcript of a recording into whatever is the approved system that you have, hopefully as your district, you have an approved enterprise one that is safe and it's something that you trust. Again, this is a lot of transparency and a lot of talking through this. I just want to be really clear and getting agreement among your team that they're okay with this. And if you start talking about sensitive stuff, you get in the habit of turning off that recording and you're not going to put out personal information. But if you can get in that habit, I always just talk to leaders about this. All those conversations you've had in your office, and then I used to want to bang my head against the wall when we would keep coming back to a conversation. Like every week we'd be like, wait, what did we decide on that? Like, wait, who was going to take the lead on that? Like, what was going to happen? That is, to me, like one of the simplest things you could do. I keep wrestling with this, and this is one of the ones I'm having the hardest time just thinking about for the future of education, is you now have the capability to create like mini databases of information that is immediately accessible for your school, for your team, whatever it may be, that you can amplify your leadership and you can amplify the work you do, because you don't have to spend 15 minutes of the meeting trying to remember what you said a month ago, right? And you can become very action orientated and very, let's close the loop on things, right? Let's actually bring things to completion and think about how we can do that. And so just that to me is really simple, and just starting there. And the reason why I always encourage that one is because if you get that team of people to start to see what's happening, I think they start to get curious. Right. And they start to want to try to explore things and try things, like we talked about with that friend of mine who took the photo and was like, maybe this will work. Right. And it's starting to get that kind of mindset that then it starts to take off. Right. And I'll just say one other thing is just the biggest piece of advice I always give people is just, if you have a question, just ask Claude or ask ChatGPT. So if you're like, hey, Carl just mentioned Claude Cowork, I have no idea what this is, can just type in, what is Claude Cowork? Can you explain this to me like someone who has absolutely no idea what he's talking about? You now have tech support on hand 24/7 that can explain things to you in a really clear way generally.
That, and especially at this time of year where hopefully folks are thinking about what you're saying with regard to like their next meeting, because all the systems are ramping up. We're rebooting for the year. To close this out, Carl, can you give us one book, podcast of the many things that you come across? Like, what's one that you would recommend our audience?
Yeah, so two things. I hope I can give a plug. We have our annual leadership conference in November in Boston. It's November 16th to 18th. It's an awesome conference that brings together leaders from around the world. It's our public school commission, independent school commission, international school commission. I encourage anyone who's interested, they can reach out to me. They can go on the website, NEASC.org, and find out about that. The book I would share is a book by Kevin Roos. I believe he was with the New York Times, who I heard recently he might have left. He wrote a book called, and it's 9 Rules for Surviving in the Age of AI. I have it sitting on my desk right here, so I'll hold it up. I would really encourage educators to read that. What impresses me most about his book is that he wrote it for the release of ChatGPT and generative AI. I think he was predicting some things that were about to happen. And what I'm really impressed by is it's held up. Even in 2026, it still feels very real. And I'll just mention he has 2 chapters that I think are really critical for teachers right now. So one is he talks about leaving handprints and how important the human touch is going to be moving forward and probably how valuable that's going to become. And then also he talks about learning future humanities, I think is the way he refers to it, or AI humanities, and just the skills that we should be learning right now. And the way I think about it is for educators is I think this is the big question everyone has is what do we teach students right now to prepare them for this future? What are the skills we should be helping them understand? Because I think that's the uneasiness a lot of people feel is that shift that's occurring, right? It doesn't feel like it aligns anymore. And so figuring out what are those skills we should be working with, and not that it's the only answer, but I think it helps open that conversation.
Thank you so much for coming on the show. This has been a pleasure, and I'm looking forward to keeping the conversation going in the year ahead and hearing more about your travels and reflections and seeing where the future takes us.
Yeah, I can't thank you so much for being on, and just I wish you the best with everything you're doing.